I've told a lot of stories over the years, and most of them have one thing in common: they started with me convincing myself I had a good reason. This one is different. The crime itself wasn't the worst thing I ever did. Not even close. But it was the first time I watched an innocent person willingly take the blame for something I had done, and the first time I realized how dangerous guilt can be when it gets mixed with loyalty. For obvious reasons, I'm changing a few names. Back then I was 26, working maintenance at a small manufacturing warehouse on the edge of town. The place was old, underfunded, and held together by duct tape, temporary repairs, and people who were too exhausted to care. I wasn't making enough money to keep up with my debts, and every month felt like I was drowning a little deeper. The person who mattered most in this story was my friend Marcus. We'd known each other since high school. He was one of those rare people who could forgive almost anything. The kind of guy who loaned money he couldn't afford to lose and never asked for it back. If someone needed help moving, Marcus showed up. If someone needed a ride at 3 in the morning, Marcus answered the phone. And if someone he cared about was in trouble, he'd walk straight into the fire for them. At the time, I thought that made him admirable. Later, I realized it made him vulnerable. The warehouse had recently received several shipments of expensive industrial components. Small boxes. Easy to move. Easy to sell. I knew exactly where they were stored. I knew exactly how weak the security was. And I knew exactly how much money I could make if a few of those boxes quietly disappeared. The idea didn't arrive all at once. It started as a fantasy. Then a possibility. Then a plan. Looking back, that transformation happened far too easily. I remember standing in the storage section one night after everyone else had left, staring at a stack of inventory worth more than my annual salary. For the first time, I seriously considered stealing from my employer. Not because I was starving. Not because I had no other options. Because I was angry. Angry at my debts. Angry at my life. Angry that I felt trapped while other people seemed to move forward effortlessly. Those feelings became excuses. And excuses have a way of turning bad ideas into decisions. What I didn't know then was that the theft itself would be the easy part. The hard part would come later, when someone who loved me like a brother would decide to confess to a crime he never committed. And the worst part? I let him. After that night in the storage room, I couldn't stop thinking about the inventory. Every shift, I found myself making mental notes, without even meaning to. Which cameras actually worked? Which doors were alarmed? Who checked the logs and who ignored them? The warehouse looked different once I'd crossed that line in my head. It stopped being my workplace and started looking like an opportunity. I spent nearly 3 weeks planning. That probably sounds excessive for stealing a few boxes, but I was terrified of getting caught. I studied the delivery schedules and learned that inventory counts only happened twice a month. Missing items could sit unnoticed for days if they were buried deep enough in the records. I also paid attention to people's habits. One supervisor left early every Friday. The night security guard spent most of his shift watching sports on a tablet. The entire plan depended on patience. The funny thing is, while I was planning a crime, I kept telling myself I wasn't actually going to do it. I think that's how people lie to themselves before they lie to everyone else. The more I planned, the calmer I became, which should have been a warning sign. Fear was being replaced by confidence, and confidence is dangerous when you're doing something stupid. I started preparing for details that most people wouldn't think about. I borrowed an old cargo van from a friend, claiming I needed it to move some furniture. I bought work gloves with cash from a store across town. Nothing dramatic, just small decisions meant to leave as little trace as possible. At work, I became unusually helpful. I volunteered for late shifts and offered to organize storage areas. Nobody questioned it. If anything, management seemed pleased that I was suddenly taking initiative. Marcus noticed the change. One evening he asked why I was spending so much time at the warehouse. I laughed it off and blamed my financial problems. That wasn't entirely a lie. The debts were real. The stress was real. What I didn't tell him was that I had already chosen a date. The following Friday. Everything was lined up perfectly. At least, that's what I believed. Every plan looks flawless right before reality gets involved. Friday arrived, and I spent the entire day pretending it was just another shift. Inside, though, my nerves were a mess. Every conversation felt louder than usual. Every glance from a coworker made me wonder if they somehow knew what I was planning. The warehouse gradually emptied as the evening went on. Forklifts were parked, lights were switched off in unused sections, and people headed home. By midnight, only a handful of us remained. I waited. That was the hardest part. Not stealing. Not lying. Waiting. Around 1 in the morning, the supervisor left exactly when I expected him to. The security guard settled into his office. I gave it another 20 minutes before making my move. I loaded the first box into a cart and pushed it through a side corridor toward the loading area. Then another. Then another. Each trip made me bolder. The strange thing was how ordinary everything felt. No alarms. No dramatic close calls. Just the sound of wheels rolling across concrete. For a moment, I actually thought I was going to pull it off without a problem. Then something unexpected happened. I was halfway through loading the last shipment into the van when I heard a voice behind me. "William?" My stomach dropped. It was Marcus. Of all the people who could have walked into that loading bay, he was the one person I never expected to see. He had come by to return a tool he'd borrowed weeks earlier. The warehouse wasn't completely locked down at night, and he'd used the employee entrance after spotting my car outside. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. His eyes moved from me to the open van and then to the boxes stacked inside. He understood immediately. The disappointment on his face hit harder than any accusation. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly. I wish I could say I confessed right then. I wish I could say guilt stopped me. Instead, I started making excuses. I talked about debt, unfair wages, and how the company would never miss the inventory. The more I spoke, the worse it sounded. Marcus didn't yell. He just stood there, looking at me like he didn't recognize the person in front of him. That reaction hurt more than anger ever could. For several minutes, Marcus tried to talk me out of it. He told me to unload the van and walk away before I made a mistake that could follow me for the rest of my life. He wasn't preaching or acting superior. He was genuinely worried. That somehow made it harder to listen. The deeper people get into a bad decision, the more they want to defend it. I argued with everything he said. I insisted I had already thought it through. I claimed nobody would get hurt. Marcus looked exhausted. Finally, he asked a question I still remember word for word. "Is this really who you want to be?" I didn't answer. Instead, I finished loading the last box. That was my answer. Marcus shook his head and left without another word. I watched him walk out of the warehouse and disappear into the darkness outside. For a second, I considered chasing after him and calling the whole thing off. But greed had already won. About 20 minutes later, I drove away with the stolen inventory. I felt terrified. I felt powerful. And for the first time that night, I also felt something else. Regret. The next morning, I barely slept. Every sound outside my apartment made me think the police had arrived. Every phone notification made my heart jump. But the hours passed, and nothing happened. By Monday, I started convincing myself I had succeeded. Then the warehouse discovered the missing inventory. The reaction was immediate. Managers were furious. Meetings were called. Employees were questioned one by one. Security footage was reviewed. People gathered in small groups, trading rumors about who might be responsible. I sat through all of it pretending to be shocked. That was harder than the theft itself. Lying face to face to people who trusted me felt different from planning a crime in private. I had to look coworkers in the eye and act offended that someone would steal from the company. The worst part was seeing Marcus. He barely spoke to me. Whenever our eyes met, he looked away. I could tell he was struggling with something, but I assumed it was disappointment. A few days later, management announced that investigators had found no clear suspect. I felt relief for exactly one day. Then Marcus did something I never saw coming. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was repairing a conveyor motor when one of the supervisors rushed through the warehouse looking stunned. People immediately started asking questions. Within minutes, the rumor spread across the building. Someone had confessed. At first, I assumed they had finally found evidence against me. Then I heard the name. Marcus. I remember standing completely still, convinced I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. Marcus had gone directly to management, and claimed he was responsible for the theft. According to the story he told them, he'd entered the warehouse late that night, taken the inventory, and sold it to cover personal debts. The details weren't perfect, but they were close enough to sound believable. I felt physically sick. The investigators questioned him for hours. By the end of the day, most people believed the case was solved. What made no sense was why. Marcus knew I was guilty. He knew exactly what happened. Yet he was willingly placing himself in danger. That evening, I drove straight to his apartment demanding answers. When he opened the door, he looked exhausted. Then he said something that changed everything. "I did it because of your sister." For a moment, I just stared at him. "My sister?" I asked. Marcus nodded and stepped aside so I could come in. His apartment looked like he hadn't slept in days. There were coffee cups everywhere, unopened mail on the table, and dark circles under his eyes. Then he told me something I hadn't known. A few months earlier, my younger sister had quietly asked him for help. My father had left behind medical debt after a long illness, and collectors had started calling her. She'd been working 2 jobs to stay afloat and still falling behind. Marcus had been helping her financially whenever he could. I felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment hearing that. Then he explained the rest. "If you get arrested," he said, "she loses you too." I told him he was being ridiculous. A theft charge wasn't worth sacrificing his future over. But Marcus disagreed. He believed I still had a chance to straighten my life out. The irony was brutal. The innocent man believed in me more than I believed in myself. And I was letting him pay the price that I spent the next hour arguing with him. I told Marcus the confession wouldn't hold up forever. Investigators would keep digging. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. At least, that was what I told him. The real reason I wanted him to take it back was simpler. I couldn't stand looking at him. Every time he spoke, the weight of what I'd done felt heavier. Marcus remained calm. He said he'd already made his decision. According to him, he had no family depending on him, no one relying on his income the way my sister relied on me. He viewed the situation like a sacrifice he was willing to make. I hated hearing that. Not because it was wrong, but because part of me was relieved. That's the truth I'm most ashamed of. Beneath all my guilt, there was a selfish voice whispering that maybe this would solve everything. Maybe I could keep my freedom and leave the consequences to someone else. When I left his apartment, I promised myself I would confess. But when morning came and the opportunity arrived, I stayed silent. Cowardice won again. The investigation moved faster after Marcus confessed. Management wanted the situation resolved, and the investigators seemed satisfied that they had someone willing to admit responsibility. There were still questions, but people naturally stop looking for answers once they think they've found them. Watching it happen was torture. Coworkers talked about Marcus differently now. Some called him desperate. Others called him stupid. A few acted sympathetic, but even they looked at him with disappointment. Nobody knew the truth except us. One afternoon, I overheard 2 employees discussing how shocked they were. They described Marcus as the last person they'd ever expect to steal. I nearly interrupted them right there. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. But once again I said nothing. The worst moment came when my sister called me. She had heard rumors and wanted to know if Marcus was okay. She sounded genuinely worried. She cared about him, and she had no idea he was protecting me. After the call ended, I sat alone for nearly an hour. For the first time, I seriously considered turning myself in. A few days later, things got worse. Marcus called me and asked if we could meet. His voice sounded different, tired, strained, almost defeated. We met at a small diner on the edge of town where hardly anyone knew us. The moment I sat down, I knew something had changed. The investigators had found additional evidence they hadn't mentioned before. Vehicle records, security timestamps, witness statements. None of it directly proved Marcus was guilty, but it created problems with parts of his story. They were pushing harder. Marcus admitted he was struggling to keep the lie consistent. Then he looked at me and asked a question I had been dreading. "Are you ever going to tell them the truth?" I couldn't answer immediately. The silence between us felt endless. Finally, I muttered that I was still thinking about it. The disappointment on his face was worse than anger. He didn't yell. He didn't insult me. He simply nodded as if he had finally accepted something about my character. That reaction hurt more than any accusation ever could. For the first time, I realized I was losing my friend forever. That night, I didn't go home right away. I drove around for hours with no destination, replaying every decision that had brought me to this point. The theft. The lies. Marcus's confession. My silence. I kept searching for a way to justify what I'd done. There wasn't one. For months, I'd blamed debt, bad luck, and unfair circumstances. But sitting alone in that car, I finally admitted the truth. Plenty of people struggle financially without stealing. Plenty of people make mistakes without letting their friends take the punishment. This wasn't about desperation anymore. It was about me. Around midnight, I parked near a river outside town and stared at the water. I remember feeling exhausted, as if I had been carrying a weight that kept getting heavier every day. Then my phone rang. It was my sister. She sounded upset. Marcus had apparently stopped answering her calls. She was worried about him and wanted me to check on him. The guilt hit me like a punch to the chest. While she was worried about Marcus, Marcus was protecting me. And I had done absolutely nothing to deserve it. The next morning, I made my decision. For the first time since the theft, I stopped thinking about consequences and started thinking about responsibility. They aren't the same thing. Consequences are what happened to you. Responsibility is what you owe other people. I went to the warehouse before my shift and asked to speak with the investigators. The entire drive there, I kept imagining ways to turn around. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost missed the parking lot entrance. When I finally sat across from them, I felt strangely calm. I told them everything. The planning. The stolen inventory. The van. Marcus finding me that night. His confession. At first, they thought I was trying to protect him. Then I started providing details that only the real thief could have known. Locations, timelines, missing records, and information they had never released publicly. The room became very quiet. Hours later, I signed a formal statement. Walking out of that office, I felt terrified about what was coming next. But for the first time in months, I wasn't carrying the lie alone. The aftermath wasn't dramatic. There was no movie-style confrontation, no shouting, no sudden redemption. I was charged, lost my job, and spent a long time dealing with the legal and financial consequences of my choices. The money I'd made from the theft disappeared almost immediately, but the damage I caused lasted much longer. Marcus was cleared once investigators verified my confession and the evidence behind it. Even then, things weren't magically repaired between us. Forgiveness isn't a switch. It's a process. For months, he barely spoke to me. Honestly, I couldn't blame him. I had stolen from my employer, lied to everyone around me, and allowed a friend to risk his future for my sake. Eventually, we rebuilt some trust, but never completely. Certain cracks remain no matter how carefully you repair them. What did I learn? A lie doesn't stay contained. It spreads. It pulls innocent people into situations they never chose. And sometimes the worst crime isn't the one you commit, it's the one you let someone else answer for. If you're ever tempted to let another person carry your guilt, don't. The cost is far higher than you think.